Hello, beautiful people. It's Cinderella. Welcome to the channel. Today we're back again with another video, and this is from Thomas. We're going to be checking some videos in regards to history, and I also love your thoughts and your opinion regarding this together or in the comments down below. Let's check it out.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible.
Emphasis on bought their slaves. So the question here is, who did they buy it from, or who were they buying the slaves from? Obviously, you know who. But this is the reason why we always say, especially here on this channel, for people to read history and set your mind free. Because some people just read one-sided or one portion of history to benefit whatever narrative they want to push. Obviously, people would hear this and be like, well, it is not true. But obviously, if you read or go down history lane, you would realize that before the race thing came about or came to play, it wasn't about race. People did not care about people's skin color. Exactly what was said here. Some people were enslaved. Those who were slaves were as a result of them being vulnerable. So the slave masters or people had to take them to captive as slaves. But of course, people would ignore all of this part and reason or look at the part that they just want to use or fine tune to fit their narrative. It don't make sense. Obviously, people should be learning history entirety of history, not a portion size or what you want to use to push to sell a certain narrative. It don't make any sense. But let me know what you think.
The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that, as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
These are the part of history or the sides of history not being told, because I mean people just exactly want to use it or sell a certain narrative for their personal gain. People don't talk about other people's involvement, they only talk about just one particular group of people's involvement in slavery. As history goes, was slavery a good thing? Of course not, it wasn't. But the essence is for people to learn the entirety of it and make sure it is not repeated. But obviously, people want it to repeat again or to happen again, and they want to sell a certain narrative where they can or be or want to be in control of how other people think, how people feel, how people react to things. That's why they sell the side that befits or benefits them. What was I told before now? I was told the white men came to invade villages. I mean, which part of it? Because obviously, yeah, we heard that part, but absolutely, didn't blacks enslave their brothers? They did, but that side of the story wasn't told because, of course, they want to make it look like the white man was the problem, or the white man was the only person or the only people engaging in slavery or that did engage in slavery. Now you understand the reason why people or schools don't talk or teach history as in regards to slavery, because they know it's going to expose the truth and people are going to learn the truth or learn about the truth. And this is the reason why no one talks, or people majorly or schools don't talk about Thomas Sowell, because of course it doesn't fit their narrative or it doesn't sell the exact same ideology they want to sell or they want to push, especially this with the woke ideology or the woke mindset. Obviously, this side of history, people don't want to talk about it, people just want to hide it. That's why they keep telling people or they keep feeding people what to think or what they want to hear. It don't make any damn sense. That's why I say if you want to learn history or if you want to talk about history as a whole, learn the entirety of history, not just the side that is beneficial, but entirety of history as a whole. But I really love your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think about this video? Have you heard of Dr. Thomas Sowell before? I really love your thoughts and your contribution in the comments down below. You can share the useful information you think might be really helpful. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and all of that stuff. And until next time, see you in the next video.